Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today because this House has a choice. We can either stand up for the rights of service members and military families, or we can allow the Republican-led House, and specifically the extreme faction of the Republican conference, to continue their assault on reproductive freedoms. For my Democratic colleagues and I, this choice is clear. We will fight. We will fight for the freedom of servicewomen and for their families, and I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to please do the same. Many of our service members joined the armed forces prior to the overturning of Roe v. Wade last June, and they did so with the understanding that they and their families would be treated with dignity and would receive comprehensive and high-quality health care services regardless of where they were stationed. And yes, that also includes access to abortion care. Since Roe was overturned, service members and their families have had access to travel and to leave if they need to, and if they need to seek reproductive health care. But unfortunately, that freedom is now being threatened today. Mr. Speaker, today, for the very first time since 1973, 14 states have passed outright abortion bans, and 7 more have passed partial bans, and 6 more have tried but have been stopped by the courts. Nearly 120,000 service members are currently stationed in Texas. 120,000 service members are currently stationed in Texas. This is a state that has implemented a draconian anti-choice law and now has among the worst maternal health outcomes for women in the entire nation. And our service women deserve better. This issue has been politicized and it has been distorted. Outright lies have been spread by elected officials and by anti-abortion activists alike. So I would like to set the record straight. Here are the facts. Women in states with abortion bans are nearly 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy, during childbirth, or soon after giving birth. And let that sink in. We are stationing our women in uniform and their families in states where they are 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy. No service member should have to accept a reality where they could literally die as a result of the anti-choice state law where they are stationed. So these are the conditions that our service women and their military families have to consider when they decide to serve. Nearly half of service members no longer have access to abortion care, and that's not counting even the members of their families as well. Our service members signed up to serve our country with the understanding that one day they may have to make the ultimate sacrifice, the sacrifice of their life. And let me remind this chamber and those who are watching that we have an all-volunteer force. Again, I will repeat, we have an all-volunteer force. So as we look to recruit and to retain the best fighters and the greatest minds that this nation has to offer, we really cannot restrict the very freedoms that we ask women and men in uniform to potentially die for. So it's important to also, as we talk, go beyond the facts and beyond the figures and to share the personal and human impact of these anti-abortion laws and the choices that we are facing this week here in this body. In Texas, the second largest state for active duty members in our country, Amanda Zerwoski was 18 weeks pregnant when her water broke, putting her at a high risk for developing a life-threatening infection. Doctors told Amanda that her life was in danger and that the fetus was going to die. But doctors could not provide the medical care that she needed because their hands were tied by Texas law. Amanda eventually did develop sepsis and did eventually nearly die. And heartbreakingly, her availability to be and get pregnant in the future might be damaged as well. Amanda survived, and she survived to share this story about her harrowing experience to hopefully prevent others from having this experience as well. So this story and the data that we have talked about today is why I'm working with my colleagues, led by my dear friend and fellow veteran, Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill, to try to codify this basic travel policy. But this body decided that women cannot be trusted to make their own reproductive health care choices. And instead, the majority in this House have decided to make it harder for service women and their families to access care, to make it harder for them to make their own health care choices, to make it harder for service women and military families to decide on their own if when and how to start their own families. And now, also, a single United States senator is holding up more than 300 military promotions and counting, hollowing out the military leadership and hurting our military readiness in the process. And he's doing this all because he is that adamant that women in uniform cannot be trusted. As a veteran myself, let me say out loud and clear that his actions are a disgrace, and Americans agree. Again, more data. 70% of our constituents believe that women should have access to abortion care. And, Mr. Speaker, the grave concerns I've outlined don't even begin to scratch the surface of all the harmful amendments that are also tacked onto this bill. Quite frankly, it's an embarrassment to this institution that our governance is just so fractured, so unable to agree on something so simple as letting a woman in uniform make the best care decisions for her family, her career, and for herself. So sadly, this is indicative of where we are today. I grew up in a military family, and I served myself. My parents didn't always agree on politics, but they shared a common love for the promises that this nation offered. My father, a refugee and Holocaust survivor, who then became a career naval aviator. I have colleagues on the other side of this aisle with whom I work with and respect, which is why I'm deeply saddened to see a bipartisan bill that endured for 60 years fall victim to this kind of partisan politics, because the bipartisan bill that we passed originally out of committee by 58-1 is literally no longer recognizable. So today, Mr. Speaker, is about choice in more ways than one. We can either let this far-right minority continue to hold our national security hostage to their radical agenda, or we can refuse to allow them to play politics with our national security and with the health and well-being of our service members. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Lady from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to this motion to instruct. This motion seeks to strip language in the House bill that prohibits the Department of Defense from spending taxpayer money to facilitate abortion procedures. DOD's abortion travel policy is a flagrant violation of Congress's intent and our nation's moral principles. This is all part of the Biden administration's politicization of the military. For years, Biden's political appointees have been pushing questionable policies on our troops just to satisfy their ideological agenda. They understand that using the military is its most efficient way to usher rapid social change that they seek. But the military should not be used as a petri dish for social experimentation. This is not the right thing to do. Our troops should not be used as the vanguard for the left's social agenda. The civilian leadership at DOD should be focused on building the world's most lethal fighting force. Instead, they're doing somersaults to try to satisfy the far left's political agenda. This misguided abortion travel policy is just another example. It's a radical overreaction to a problem that doesn't exist. Secretary Austin said that the policy was necessary to avoid, quote, significant implications for readiness of the force, close quote. But in 6 months since this began, there have been less than a handful of people who have exercised this policy. Rather than helping readiness, radical policies like this one are undermining readiness. They're driving away potential recruits, and they're undermining morale and retention, and it needs to end. I urge all members to oppose this motion. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. A lady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Just before I introduce our next person, I want to emphasize that this is not a new policy. The DOD is not simply creating a new policy out of thin air. The DOD is in fact using precedent from the non-availability of care and simply allowing women with reproductive health service needs to be able to have effective travel and reimbursement for said travel. Again, this is not a new policy, and it simply updates a policy that allows for travel reimbursement to ensure that we have equal access to health care. Thankfully, we have a president in Joe Biden who is responsive to the needs of our military service members and who supports this effort. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Representative McCollum.
The lady from Minnesota is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania for the time. Hopefully, at some point on this floor, we'll be able to debate the Defense Appropriations Bill. That bill and this bill that we have the motion on, the NDAA, have extreme social policy riders that make bipartisan cooperation just impossible. The restricting rider that we're focusing on today, and it's in both bills, stops service members and civilians and from dependents from seeking basic reproductive health care. And as the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania pointed out, when certain care is not available at where a person is stationed, they have the flexibility of going to seek out that health care. So the DOD's current policy is totally under federal law and is totally legal. And in fact, another misnomer that I hear quite often is somehow it's undermining the Hyde Amendment. Well, it doesn't do that either. The Hyde Amendment allows for abortion services in certain circumstances. This would be a ban if a woman was stationed at a military post where we don't even offer obstetrics and gynecology, where she would have to seek care in another state. And many of these states have limited and put so many restrictions that the doctors are fearful of performing even procedures after miscarriage, or procedures that was pointed out with the woman in Texas. So they have to go someplace else to receive the service, even services that are provided under the Hyde Amendment. And make no mistake, I don't support the Hyde Amendment, but that's the least we should be able to do. As has been pointed out, nearly 20% of the women serve in our military. 80,000 of them are in states that restrict abortions, and our troops don't get to choose where they're stationed. So, folks, we need to make sure that our service women are not treated as second-class citizens and that they have full access to their reproductive rights. In the past and in the future, women have faced barriers to reach their full potential. Let's not put up another barrier. I thank you, and I yield back.
The lady's time has expired. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to an outstanding member of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Jackson of Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Rogers, for your outstanding leadership in crafting the strongest defense bill that I've seen during my time in Congress. Year after year, the chairman assures us that we're going to have a strong NDAA that we can be proud of back home, and this year has been no different. In July, this body passed the NDAA on a bipartisan basis to provide our warfighters with the resources and the authorities they need to provide for the defense of our nation. As a former Navy Rear Admiral, I know the vital role this legislation plays in our national security. Not only does this NDAA assure that we have the weapons systems and equipment our service members need, it makes needed course corrections to restore the military's focus on fighting and winning wars. This bill ensures that our military is laser focused on confronting the most pressing national security threats that our nation faces. However, now my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have chosen to come to the floor and are seeking to inject politics back into our military, overturning the Jackson-Roy Amendment that was adopted on a bipartisan basis to end the Department of Defense's illegal and immoral abortion policy. After the Supreme Court's historic decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, the Biden administration made their intention clear that they would work to sidestep the law however possible. The Biden administration has pulled every lever within the federal government and encouraged federal agencies to create rules and adopt policies that not only expand abortion access, but also leave American taxpayers on the hook to subsidize abortion services. Not even the Department of Defense was spared from the Biden administration's efforts. So in October of last year, the Secretary of Defense released a memo titled Ensuring Access to Reproductive Health Care. This memo outlined the steps to be taken by the department to use taxpayer dollars to provide service members and their dependents access to abortions and for providers to travel to different states to obtain the licensing required to perform such procedures. Then, in February of this year, the DoD enacted the policies outlined in the memo and became a completely unjustified and inappropriate participant in the war on life. According to its illegal policy, DoD can now reimburse travel expenses for service members and their dependents who travel to obtain an abortion in another state, and can also reimburse associated fees for healthcare professionals seeking to be licensed in other states for the purpose of performing abortions, all, once again, on the taxpayer's dime. Last year, immediately after the DoD started this unconstitutional process, Congressman Roy and I got to work to address this issue and ensure that we developed a bill to right this wrong. I am so proud to stand on the House floor today and say that our provision mandating the DoD cease this insanity was successfully included in the House-passed version of the bill. At the same time, Senator Tuberville has bravely and steadfastly held the line in the Senate by placing a hold on all DOD senior leader nominations until the DOD complies with federal law and ceases its abortion policies. DOD has complained that these holds harm national security, but DOD has the ability to stop this immediately. All they have to do is rescind this illegal policy. It has become clear to me that the Biden administration has purposely prioritized an illegal and highly political abortion policy over confirming general and flag officers in the military. This Biden-endorsed policy has nothing to do with strengthening our national security. Instead, this is just the latest example of the Biden administration pushing its radical and extreme pro-abortion agenda, ironically, in the very agency responsible for defending American lives. Regardless of your political or moral stance on abortion, this policy is in direct violation of federal law, specifically Section 1093 of Title 10 U.S. Code, which restricts funds made available to DOD from being used to perform abortions or for DOD facilities to be used for abortions. No doubt my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will insist that taxpayer dollars are not directly funding these abortions, thereby rendering their policy legally sound. This is absolutely misleading, and they are lying to the American people. While funds may not be going directly to the performance of the procedure, it has always been true that restriction on funding for abortion is a restriction on funding for any costs used to promote or facilitate the abortion. Funding travel and or other costs for an abortion is in fact funding the abortion. There is no other reason for these travel expenses except to get an abortion. Therefore, providing financial support to the travel expenses relating to an abortion is a clear violation of laws that are already on the books. The NDAA is meant to provide aid, support, and direction to the men and women charged with defending the security of this nation. When necessary, it is also a mechanism through which we can bring the department into compliance as needed. Inclusion of the House's prohibition on DOD's abortion policy in this year's NDAA is vital to bringing the department into statutory compliance in accordance with our oversight function and refocusing the department on its core mission of fighting and winning wars. It stops here and it stops now. On this issue, I will never relent. The days of the radical left ignoring the law and driving their social agenda in the military are done. I will absolutely not waver in my defense of the unborn or in my support of the rule of law. I will do everything I can to ensure our military service members can focus on the jobs and their families instead of being used to support score political points for the Biden administration. I appreciate the chairman's strong leadership in crafting this year's bill, and I look forward to the conference process where we will do everything in our power to maintain this vital provision.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Alabama reserves. The lady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Here are the facts. Not a single dollar is going towards paying for an abortion under the current DOD travel policy, which only provides for leave and travel reimbursements for servicewomen who are forced to travel for their health care due to restrictive laws of the state that they are stationed in line with a very long-standing DOD policy that has always provided for travel and leave where specialized health care is not provided or allowed for. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Slotkin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The lady from Michigan is recognized.
Pardon, Mr.
for
Speaker.
2 minutes.
Thank you. I rise today to call out the amendments that have been forced into the Pentagon budget over the past month and a half. When this Pentagon budget was voted on in our committee, it passed 58-1. I voted for it, as did many of my peers on this side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle. When it left our committee, it became a wish list of right-wing culture war agenda. If you take a 40,000-foot view of what's going on here, it becomes very clear. The other side of the aisle is not going to stop until there is a federal ban on all abortions in every state, in every circumstance. Our last speaker made it clear. A bill that is typically bipartisan is now become a prisoner of this debate. So let's review the bidding. We have seen the other side of the aisle put in unnecessary abortion restrictions in minor appropriations, in veterans bills targeting female veterans. A single senator is holding up 300 critical military nominations because service members want to get leave to get the care that they need. And the NDAA in its current form is targeting servicewomen specifically. Do not make a mistake The United States should hear that in every place, in every possible window, the people on the other side of the aisle are going to continue their 50-year pledge to get rid of all abortions everywhere. They're open about that. And while those of them who are in competitive elections may try to mealy-mouth what they have done for the past 20 years, we need to hear what they are telling us. The other side of the aisle is taking national security issues now hostage to their unrelenting fight on this issue, so that no woman can have a right to an abortion if she's been raped, if she's the victim of incest, or for simple miscarriage, which 1 out of 3 women in America have had. I know the other side of the aisle is not listening in this issue. The American people need to hear it loud and clear. They want a federal ban on abortion. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is not recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time I'd like to yield 1 minute to a great new member of the Armed Services Committee and a longtime champion of the unborn in America, Mike Johnson of Louisiana.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank Chairman Rogers and Dr. Jackson for their important work on this really critical issue. Mr. Speaker, historically, Americans have traditionally held the most positive view of the U.S. military among all of our institutions, but something changed last year. Right now, less than half of Americans now have a great deal of confidence and trust in the military. You want to know why? The reason stated is because the military leadership has become overly politicized. They're addressing issues that don't have anything to do with our national defense. And the best example of that probably is Secretary Austin's policy of reimbursing travel expenses for service members seeking an abortion. The law is clear, as the chairman has stated. Title 10, Section 1093 explicitly prohibits funds available to DOD from being used to perform abortions. The statute was drafted, passed, and signed into law by the people's duly elected representatives. And this politicized Department of Defense has decided to create a workaround. Thankfully, the House-passed NDAA will end this lawlessness. We have to stand for that. The House has spoken on the issue, and the House's position is very clear. I urge my colleagues to defeat this motion to instruct, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is not recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we don't get to choose what our facts are. The chilling effect that is happening right now on recruiting is caused by a variety of things, but the number one reason, the number one contributing factor to a service member's decision to enlist or to re-enlist is the support of their spouse. If we are showing the entire country that we don't trust women and families to be in control of their own health care decisions, why would they encourage anyone in their family to re-enlist or to enlist in the service at all? Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge the conferees to strike this truly abhorrent provision from the National Defense Authorization Act. As several of my colleagues have pointed out, when this bill went out of committee, out of the Armed Services Committee, it passed with a very strong bipartisan 58-1 vote, and then extremists within the Republican Party got a hold of it and made floor amendments and put poison pills, including this one, in the bill. So a couple of facts. Number one, no taxpayer money is going to provide abortions for service members. The long-standing policy of the Department of Defense is we allow service members to travel for necessary medical procedures and care when they can't get that care on a base or locally. That is long-standing policy, and that's what we're talking about here today. But you've also heard a bunch of my colleagues get up today and say, you know, this has nothing to do with national defense. This is superfluous, nothing to do with the national defense of our country. Really? We can spend money and buy all the best tanks and aircraft carriers and missiles that money can buy. But what actually makes us strong? It's our people. Our people are behind all of that. And what undergirds people is the trust within a unit. I served 3 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I can tell you, if you don't trust the person you're going to war with, it's all meaningless. So are we really going to set up a system where our women service members are second-class citizens within our units and undermine the very trust and integrity of those units? No, we should not and will not, and I will stand against that. Number 2, we are suffering historic recruiting shortages in our military. And are we really going to send a message to our young women who want to stand up and serve our country and maybe give their lives that they can't access the same care
as their male counterparts?
Gentleman's recognized.
Is that the message we want to send? No. You can't say you're for our national security and also support this measure, but more than anything else, this is a moral argument. I don't want to see yellow ribbons tied around trees. I don't want to see people thank people for their service. I don't want to see 10% discounts on coffee or meals. If you're willing to support a policy that undermines the morality of this country and the ability of our young men and women to get the care they need, and for our young servicewomen in particular to be treated equally. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I would like to make one correction, that this is a new policy. This was not existing policy. It was announced on October 20th against the advice of the congressional leadership and finalized on February 16th. They just didn't take existing policy and continue it. But with that, I would like to at this time recognize a great new freshman member, Representative Self of Texas, for 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise. I agree with my colleagues across the aisle. You cannot choose your own facts, and this is a moral discussion. Abortion is not reproductive health. Abortion takes a life. There are 2 people involved in this issue, and one of them dies. This is not health care. This is not a political issue. It is a moral issue that our nation needs to grapple with. This motion must not pass. I yield back.
The gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield my 2 minutes to the gentlelady and former Speaker of the House from California, Ms. Pelosi.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentlewoman for yielding and for her leadership on this issue. I want to commend the chair and ranking member of the Armed Services Committee for the legislation that came out of their committee, 58-1, the bipartisanship to protect and defend, which is the oath of office that we take, all of us, to serve in government. And also, though, to acknowledge that on the floor of this House, these poisonous resolutions came forward and were added to the bill, and I rise to move to instruct House conferees to honor our men and women in uniform by protecting their fundamental health freedom. I was listening with interest and prayerfully, frankly, to the previous speaker who decided that terminating a pregnancy is not a health issue. Well, for some people, it might be. Do you believe in the Hyde Amendment? I'm not a fan of the Hyde Amendment, but that is the law of the land. And under the Hyde Amendment, if there's rape, incest, or the life of the mother is at risk, then that changes the dynamic in terms of public policy. Now, suppose a family member has life of the mother at risk, or a child of a service member is a victim of violence and rape in the community. Would you want that person to have their health needs met? If they're in a state that says absolutely not, then their health needs, then they would have to travel elsewhere, in keeping with the Hyde Amendment. So if you believe in the Hyde Amendment, which I don't subscribe to, but you do, many of you do, if you believe in that, how can you deprive the life of a mother, whether it's a servicewoman herself or the spouse of a service person or a child of a service member, the ability to seek the health that they need? The NDAA has long been bipartisan. This year, House Republicans are now engaging in a version that would restrict service members receiving full reproductive rights. This is disrespectful. Shame on those who play political games with the courageous people who would give their lives to save ours. With that, I thank you for the time and yield back.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. And a reminder to all members, please direct your remarks at the chair. The gentleman from Alabama is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I share the sentiment of the most recent speaker. I think it is shameful that the DOD has been playing games with the troops in this country. At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Miller.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Congressman Jackson for working tirelessly to stop Joe Biden from using our military to fund abortions and his woke agenda. Throughout this year, we fought to incorporate an amendment into the defense bill to protect the religious liberty of our service members and prevent the Biden Pentagon from funding abortions. The American people do not want the military paying for abortions. Biden's radical left-wing transformation of our military has created a recruitment and retention crisis, which puts our military readiness in crisis. I thank my colleagues in the House who have fought to keep our military from funding abortions. No taxpayer funds should ever be used to fund abortions, and I will continue to advocate for innocent life. As the saying goes, America is great because America is good. Abortion is evil, and we can never become advocates for killing innocent babies in the womb. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is now recognized.
Just a reminder that our President Biden knows personally what it means to support those in uniform and to keep the administration's promise to make sure that our servicemen and women are protected as they serve us all. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Smith, and ranking member of the Armed Services Committee.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple quick points. First of all, there's no legality issue here. This policy is clearly and unequivocally legal. As the quotes from the Hyde Amendment said earlier, the Hyde Amendment says that the government can't pay for an abortion or use their services for abortion. The travel policy does not do either one of those things. So there's nothing illegal, nothing unconstitutional. This is a policy choice, and we've heard some very passionate arguments on both sides about what that policy choice should be. But number one, let's put aside this ridiculous notion, this illegal, unconstitutional, ridiculous. No, this is a perfectly legal policy that on a policy ground you disagree with. Number two, in response to Chairman Rogers' comment about this being a new policy, it's not really a new policy in the following sense. It has always been the policy of the Department of Defense that if you cannot get the health care that you need where you're at, they will pay to take you to where you can. Now, prior to the Dobbs decision, that was not an issue when it came to reproductive services. The Dobbs decision changed that. The Biden administration didn't support the Dobbs decision and didn't make that happen. Once that happened, service members in many, many states were no longer able to get the reproductive health care that they needed or wanted where they were. So therefore, the travel policy that has been a long time existing policy then applied. It applied to service members seeking reproductive health care that couldn't get it in the state where they were. This is not a change in policy, and it's not illegal. It is a policy choice. And as a number of speakers have mentioned, it's an important policy choice on the very recruitment issue. It will be harder to recruit women if they are not protected. And I think the former speaker made an outstanding argument for why it is really important. Even if you don't believe in abortion, if you have a miscarriage, you need these services that you cannot get. This is crucial to recruitment. And the last point on this, we keep hearing about the military, is not popular anymore because of Biden's woke policies, which is ridiculous to the extent that the military has gone down in credibility.
Gentleman's time has expired.
15 seconds.
I yield 30 more seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
It's because so many people are running around trashing our military, saying they're excessively woke. That our military is the best in the world. It's the best in the world today with those policies. And continuously undercutting and trashing our military as being weak and woke is hurting recruitment. I will grant you that. But it is completely wrong, as is Senator Tuberville's efforts to gut the military's ability to do its job because he disagrees with the policy. We had a vote on it. President Biden got elected. He made his decision. Change the policy. Don't trash the military. Thank you.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Alabama is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time I'd like to yield 2.5 minutes to a longtime champion of the unborn in America, Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank my good friend for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the motion to instruct. Let's be absolutely clear. Current federal DOD law already permits taxpayer funding of abortion in cases of rape, incest, and to save the life of the mother. But the Biden DOD abortion travel policy forces taxpayers to pay the transportation costs for military members and dependents to travel to procure an abortion for any reason whatsoever, right up until the moment of birth. Some states, like my state of New Jersey, and there are many others like it, like New York and California, have enacted extremist laws that legally sanction the killing of a baby for any reason whatsoever, right up until the moment of birth. The Biden policy has no limits on gestational age, so it facilitates aborting babies through all 9 months. There is nothing humane, Mr. Speaker, or benign about abortion. Abortion is not health care unless one construes the precious life of an unborn child analogous to a tumor, to be excised, or a disease to be vanquished. Dr. Ronald Jackson's House-passed amendment to the NDAA overturns the DOD abortion travel policy. Regrettably, the pro-abortion culture is truly a culture of denial, continues to deny, devalue, and disrespect unborn children, both boys and girls. We must recognize the breathtaking miracle of the newly created life of an unborn child and that women deserve better than abortion. We need to care for both. We need to love them both. I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that future generations will someday look back on us and wonder how and why a society that bragged about its commitment to human rights could have legally sanctioned and aggressively promoted child beheadings, because they do behead the child during the process of a dismemberment abortion, other dismemberment, abortion pills. How do they work? They literally starve the child to death. That's how they work. I work on global hunger and food insecurity issues in my district and throughout the country and world all the time. How does the abortion pill work? It starves the baby to death. Please, Mr. Speaker, I call on my colleagues, don't force taxpayers to facilitate abortion on demand. Yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Representative Garamendi.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I'm honored to stand here beside my women colleagues in support of this very important motion. As they have shared, we have an essential duty to protect the rights of our service members, their reproductive rights. We protect the decisions that they must be able to make about their own body. When service members volunteer, they know that they will be making sacrifices. They know that they will have to follow orders. They know that they'll have to take on hard missions and do whatever is necessary to defend our country. One thing they did not sign up for is to sacrifice their fundamental medical care and the fundamental rights to their own body. Access to medical care has a direct impact on military readiness. I'm very surprised to find that the very people that are claiming to care about our military's capability and readiness are pushing policies which will actively degrade our fighting forces. Denying access to medical care sends a loud and clear message to every woman in the military now and to every other woman that may want to join the military. That is, your reproductive rights will not be honored or will not even exist should you join the military. That's a message that will be sent to 18% of the women who make up our military today. And it will send the same message to every other woman that might want to join the military in the future. These policies that are in this bill will chase women away from what they want, that is to patriotically serve our country in the military. It's the wrong message. This particular instruction should pass this House if we care about the readiness of our military. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
Gentleman from Alabama has 18 minutes left remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time I'd like to yield 2.5 of those 18 minutes to an outstanding member of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Fallon.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we've heard a lot of claims, some of them very hyperbolic, and some which I would just classify as drivel from some of the prior speakers. It's one thing to disagree, but we should at least be truthful, okay? So let's look at the amendment itself, Section 716, lines 9 through 14, and I quote, "The Department of Defense may not use any funds for abortions except where the life of the mother would be endangered if the fetus were carried to term or in a case where the pregnancy is the result of rape or incest." So let's be truthful, Mr. Speaker. At least we're making some progress. Some of the members, our friends across the aisle, have actually used the term woman instead of birthing person. So there's something that has been, I think, at least for me, given me some hope. The question before us is a simple one. Are we a rule of nation, a rule of law nation, or not? Secretary Austin, in his decision to pay service members to pursue abortions, is a clear violation of current law, the Hyde Amendment. We're hearing that necessary health care, is it necessary health care or is it an elective abortion? Because necessary health care, in the case of, let's say, rape, is already covered under the Hyde Amendment. And don't paint us with some wide brush to say that we want to take that right away. I would submit that many Republicans want to protect women that have been impregnated because of rape. That is absurd, and it really is very unfair. Is the DOD complying with federal law right now or not? And this policy doesn't. By prohibiting funding for this policy, the NDAA is simply ensuring we maintain the protections that are already enshrined in current law. So again, it's one thing to disagree, but to make these hyperbolic, untrue claims doesn't serve the purposes of a spirited exchange of ideas or an honest debate. Secretary Austin, if you want to be honest, is playing politics. And if he would simply follow the law, 300 general and flag officers would get the promotions that they're due. The only person and people that are jeopardizing readiness are right now Secretary Austin and President Biden and his administration. Our bill puts an end to this nonsense once and for all. I support the amendment. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask how much time we have remaining?
8 minutes left remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'd like now to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Representative Moulton.
Gentleman is recognized.
I want to thank my colleague from Pennsylvania. My Republican colleagues often blame the military's current recruitment crisis on DEI initiatives. They say the military is becoming too woke and that it's driving away recruits. The only problem with that is that the survey data that we have actually says the exact opposite. It says that what recruits are concerned about is being welcomed into an organization that will accept who they are. With this anti-abortion policy, Republicans are effectively telling 50% of America and 20% of our current fighting force, you are not welcome here because of who you are. If you're a white guy, you're probably fine, but if you're a woman, sorry, you're a second-class citizen. You don't have the health care options that the rest of us have. It's no wonder that every branch except the Marine Corps is struggling to meet recruitment goals. Instead of seriously focusing on how we deter a war with China, we're having politically motivated debates in this chamber over a woman's private health care decisions. And what my Republican colleagues won't say is that the DOD's abortion travel policy does not even pay for this medical care. It doesn't even pay for it. It simply allows a woman who's put her life on the line for our country the necessary leave if she is stationed in a state where abortions are not available. I voted against the NDAA because it doesn't support our service members. It makes them political pawns. It's a slap in the face to every woman who serves or might consider it in the future. We need to treat women with the respect they deserve for serving our country. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Houchin.
The gentlelady is now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Thank you for yielding. Let me just start by saying killing a baby is not health care if it's done in an elective abortion. And clearly the Hyde Amendment gives exceptions for life of the mother, rape, and incest. So, Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't really have to be here talking about this issue today, but we are. The amendment we are speaking in support of today would repeal the Department of Defense's policy that facilitates elective abortion at taxpayer expense. Whether those funds are for travel or any other purpose related to abortion, they're illegal. Mr. Speaker, it seems pretty cut and dry to me and many of my colleagues. What the Department of the Defense is doing now is not in line with long-standing and current law according to the Hyde Amendment. While the administration might disagree with the Supreme Court's decision with respect to Dobbs, that does not give them the right to circumvent the law. Taxpayer funds should not be spent on elective abortion, period. Republicans are not the one polarizing this country, are injecting wokeness and politics into the institutions entrusted with our defense. It's quite the contrary. May I have more time?
I yield additional 30 seconds.
Recognize.
Republicans are not the one polarizing the country or injecting wokeness and politics into institutions entrusted with our defense. It's quite the contrary. What we're trying to do is strip those things out of the Department of Defense and return them to their sacred duty of defending the country. I voted in support of this amendment during the House consideration of the NDAA because it was the right thing to do. As the House just agreed to proceed in conference, I strongly encourage House conferees to advocate for its inclusion in the final product in conference. This is an issue about the rule of law, pushing back on the administration that has demonstrated its appetite to ignore it. I thank the chairman of the Armed Services Committee for his leadership as we head into conference. Thank you.
The gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is now recognized.
I'm prepared to close.
The gentlelady reserves.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to yield 1 1/2 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, a great member of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Mark Alford.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I stand with my colleagues to oppose the motion to obstruct and to repeal facilitating abortions funded by the Department of Defense and, in effect, taxpayers. Following the Supreme Court's landmark Dobbs decision, the Biden administration sought ways to bypass the ruling. They have encouraged federal agencies to not only expand abortion access, but also to burden American taxpayers with the cost. Last October, the Secretary of Defense released a memo entitled Ensuring Access to Reproductive Health Care. Let's get something straight, Mr. Speaker. There is nothing reproductive about abortion. Abortion ends a life. It does not reproduce. This memo paves the way for taxpayer money to facilitate abortions for service members and their dependents. It even allows for the reimbursement of travel expenses for those seeking abortions in another state. Taxpayers' funds for the DOD are meant for national defense, not to further a pro-abortion agenda. Now, let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. We believe in the life-affirming care for the mother and the baby that God is growing inside of her. But we also believe that the government in no way, no shape, and no form should be paying to facilitate ending that life. I urge my colleagues to back this amendment, defeat the motion to obstruct, and let's save some lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Beth Van Dyne.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this motion, though I will admit that it's very nice to hear my Democrat colleagues are finally concerned with military recruitment. I wish they were worried about military recruitment when they were voting to kick out of the military members who didn't want to get the jab, when they were voting to support the botched Afghanistan withdrawal that led to so many unnecessary deaths. They seem to have already changed the recruitment videos from "come be all you can be" to "come and get an abortion." How proud they must be. This is no more than a federal power grab, usurping state laws that were legally and constitutionally created by state legislators elected by a majority of voters from each state. This is a federal power grab by a party intent on forcing its radical political agenda down the throats of Americans who overwhelmingly don't want it. As President Biden and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle know, the Hyde Amendment, which President Biden supported for decades, explicitly prohibits federal dollars from being used for taxpayer-funded abortions. Nearly 60% of Americans agree that taxpayer dollars should not be used to fund abortions. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserve?
No, Mr. Speaker. I understand you're reserving?
I reserve.
Great. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
The gentlelady from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the chairman for yielding me this time. I rise to oppose the motion to instruct conferees to not include my colleague, Representative Ronnie Jackson's amendment in the fiscal year 24 NDAA. This policy is a gross misuse of taxpayer dollars to circumvent state laws and violates the decades-old bipartisan Hyde Amendment. It is clear that Joe Biden and Lloyd Austin's Department of Defense is more focused on appeasing the woke mob of pink hat-wearing feminists than focusing on keeping our nation safe. This is the same DOD that surrendered to the Taliban, costing the lives of 13 brave service members. This is the same DOD treating our military like a woke social experiment. And this is the same DOD the House will vote to fund later this week. The Department of Defense should be focused on readiness and lethality, not spending taxpayer dollars to kill the lives of innocent unborn babies. We're not going to give up on this cause that is righteous, and we're not going to stop fighting to give voice to the voiceless. Since Roe v. Wade in 1973, over 63 million lives have been lost to abortion. I personally have held a newborn baby born at 23 weeks old, 1 pound, 8 ounces. And I know that her life has just the same worth and value as any one of us standing here today. I want to thank my friend and colleague, Congressman Ronnie Jackson, for his leadership in restoring our military focus and protecting these precious unborn lives. I'm proud to stand with my colleagues in defense of these children, as well as with millions of Americans across our nation. I urge my colleagues to oppose this motion to instruct. And Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I understand my colleague is ready to close. I have no further speakers. If you have none, I can close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady is recognized.
I would like to reserve 30 seconds for myself.
The gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
I would like very much, Mr. Speaker, if I could ask you to ask my colleagues to not presume to judge who I am. I stand here as a woman who has worn the uniform, who has given birth while wearing the uniform, to have assumptions about who I am or what I am, and to judge me or any of my other colleagues who have worn the uniform, to me is an offense. And I would ask that you advise them not to presume anything about me.
Gentlelady reserved. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
This provision protects life and restores sanity to the Department of Defense. I urge all members to oppose the motion and yield back the balance of my time.